10 años pasaron ya.
Okie dokie. I think we can go ahead and start now. Um, Let me just pull up my little notes or whatever. But hi guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Yadira. I am the social media manager for DSARGV. In case you don't know me. But yeah, thank you for making the time to come out today, on a Sunday evening and just, having a little conversation with us. And so, yeah, thank you guys for coming and thank you, Gab, for making the time to be here. I appreciate it so much. And to just start off, the purpose of today's Red Talk is to just start a conversation, one that helps us make the connections between our communities here in the Rio Grande Valley, or rather the US-Mexico border, with the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine. So yeah, just a conversation that allows us to recognize that it's like a shared struggle against border militarization and occupation. Um, and so yeah, that's why I invited Gab Schivone, right? Is it Schivone or Schivone?
Half of our family on one part of the country says Schivone and the other half says Schivone. So it's like,
Okay, okay, sweet. Um, anyway, sorry. So yeah, that's why I invited Gab Schivone today, so we can learn more about this intersection and to just hear about their experience on the Freedom Flotilla back in 2011. So just a little bit about our guest. They've written, oh, well, they're journalists, they're an activist and author, and their work has appeared in The Guardian, The Nation, Huffington Post, Dropsite News, The Intercept, and currently a reporter for Rolling Stone. So without further ado, Gab Schivone.
hi everybody, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to speak to y'all, especially as organizers, radical organizers, whom we need more in this country and the world, but especially in this country. So I'm very happy to talk about whatever y'all would like to hear. Y'all have questions. uh, I'd be happy to start that way if you'd like, rather than be a talking head. So many lectures I'm at that just talk and they talk and they talk. And then usually the most interesting parts are in the Q&A. So I thought, what tell me what y'all would like to talk about.
You guys can put in the chat or feel free to um, speak on the mic.
I can go. Hey y'all, how's it going? This is Jose Jimenez, he him pronouns. Coming out of Rio Hondo, Texas, down here in the valley. Thanks for joining us today. I guess I think the initial question or one to kick us off is something along the lines of like, what's the single most effective, organizing strategy folks down in the valley could be engaging in? Um, I think that would be helpful to know, and just if you could provide any insight on that, or just like in the frontera in general, what is a focus that our all of our organizations should be engaging in?
Sure. It's first thing that comes to mind is what really captivated me, I think, when I started learning about this. Fortunately, I was raised in a very principled radical community here in Tucson. And why I say that word is because my mom was born in Navajoa in Sonora, like several hours from here, south of here, and came over just after Operation Wetback. If some of y'all are under the Dwight Eisenhower administration, hundreds of thousands of deportations, a huge, one of the largest military mobilizations in the post-war period. And I, the wall had started to be built under Clinton, and it was very little by little by little. And over the years, my family saw each other less and less because it was harder to cross over. And this is going on in my head. I'm just seeing and observing and not connecting the dots yet until I meet a radical community. And on the question of effective strategies, like education is such a education and outreach is so huge because it can change lives and change moments of people, especially when it's their first encounter and they connect it to their lived experiences and their observed experiences. So me as a teenager being raised in a radical community that was principled in terms of Palestine, because Palestine was, some of you might know, was just abandoned by the left for decades. And even in the most recent war on Iraq, like talked with if you talk with Palestinian organizers, they'll remember when they wanted to downplay, we need to be against the war in Iraq. Don't bring in Palestine here. And it's only relatively recently that we're seeing that change. And as another example of what was very effective here, when a group, Students for Justice in Palestine, and No Mas Muertes, No More Deaths, a student chapter of a larger humanitarian organization here on the border. What we were doing on the University of Arizona campus, where I'm at now, I have a fellowship here on campus, and at the time, I wasn't technically a student here, but I was nevertheless doing student organizing because it still was my constituency in terms of youth. And we asked ourselves, like, what? And so here's like, we're getting more at the question, like when it comes to effective strategies, as you all know better than most, you look around at what you have to work with, and then you decide from there, because every community has its differences and strengths. And so, for example, because we were, happened to be on a university campus that wasn't tiny, like there are some liberal arts colleges that are 800 people. There's no anonymity on a campus like that. Everybody knows each other. So there are some things that work better and then some things that don't. On this campus, it's fucking 50,000 people. So it's the number one employer in the city. There's no anonymity. And so for us, rather than try and get like a referendum passed, which can be very impressive because it's very hard to do, of getting people in the community to vote for, say, like boycott, divestment, sanctions, which typically really is only a divestment with regard to, say, institutional investment surrounding us. We can't do that with 50,000 people in a group of half a dozen or a dozen organizers. So what we thought was, well, we need to turn to mass disruption. And so what we decided to do was, and this was the same year that I went on the flotilla, this was 2011, and we decided to, this is almost laughable, but because I don't know how we pulled this off, but we decided to disrupt the entire freedom of movement of our whole community of 50,000 people, create a crisis, that phrase that was prevalent in Dr. King's strategy that he wrote about in a letter from Birmingham jail, to create a situation that is so tension packed that everybody that normally could avoid or ignore this topic simply cannot ignore it anymore, because they can't walk from one place to another. Like we set up a barbed wire fence, 400 feet long, no, 1,200 feet long. I'm sorry, it was the length of 4 football fields with barbed wire on top. And the university sanctioned it and allowed it to happen. We got the student government to pay for it, and a vendor, a local fencing company, to set it up. So it's kind of like a microcosm of how this kind of stuff works. The U.S. government pays multinational corporations, both Israeli and United States, to build a wall, and then it cut off the freedom of movement of the entire campus, and people were fucking pissed. But that was, what we were going for, and we inserted into that space a vacuum, if you will, of uh, our our narrative, and we got the Associated Press to cover it. It was a and then the University of Arizona got quite a lot of heat. They didn't know what they were in for, obviously, and the Phoenix legislature came down on them very hard, and so they prevented something like this from happening ever again. But it did happen, and that's just one example of how education and disruption worked hand in hand, and they usually do. And that was very instructive, informative for me in a way, as I had around that time put in an application to be a passenger on the what was called Gaza Freedom Flotilla II. It's the first one, the biggest one at that time, had been launched the summer before, and Israel killed about more than a dozen passengers, and so there was a lot more attention on it than there was before. I didn't expect to be chosen as one of the passengers, but then kind of forgot about it, and we did this wall, and then I was chosen, and then I was like, oh shit, well, I guess I gotta go now. I had to uh, go on that boat, and it was a yeah, 2011 was a quite a busy year for me in that respect, and I had been writing. I wasn't a professional journalist yet. That came a little later, but I had always been writing. That's one of my strengths that I love to do, and I liked. I was skilled at researching and writing and interviewing, and so I decided to utilize that as much as I could, and then apply it to organizing. But I think it always goes back to education and outreach and disruption and action of various sorts. I hope that was a. I know that was Jose. That was all over the place. So.
No, you very much closed the loop there. Thank you. Appreciate it.
What are some of the challenges that y'all are facing? I understand that a number of you are spread out in smaller communities, but you're connecting together in a way just like they're connecting in New York City because they're, I guess you could say organizers there deal with a lot more stimuli, so to speak, a lot more people surrounding them. But yeah, I'm very curious to hear about that and also take more questions.
D Delgado, you can go.
My name is actually Bruno. Uh, I don't know why my phone puts it like that. I don't know how to change it, but so I guess what I'm seeing is like a lot of people because of the Trump's agenda and the economic situations here in the border. Like a lot of people are like, okay, so like socialism and DSA calls to me because I'm facing domestic issues like I can't afford my groceries or people in my community are getting. My bad. But when it comes to Palestine, at least some of the people that I talk to is like, okay, I understand uh, that we should get involved because of the issues that affect me, but I don't see how Palestine affects me. Of course, I know how it affects me, right? We understand kind of how it does, but I'm having a little bit of issue like reaching those people who are like more focused on domestic issues and how to relate to them. Like, listen, this issue actually affects you too, you know? So how would you approach it, or how have you approached that in your own experience?
Oh, great question. And one that I wanted to get into during the answer to the last question. One of the reasons Palestine was so powerful impacting me was, I was in this anti-war and radical community where Palestine wasn't a very important issue, just as important as the war in Iraq and U.S.-Mexico border issues were swirling all around. That's when deaths in the desert started to really rise, and nobody was doing anything about it. And then groups started to crop up, like No Mas Muertes here, to try and end death in the desert, but also get at the root issues of what is what is pushing out people to leave their homes. And one, as I looked more and more into it, Israel was there at every turn, like helping the United States to just devastate, especially countries in Central America in the times of our parents and or some of us when we were children or after we were born, and contributing to these massive waves of both political refugees and economic migrants. And that's still something that people don't really talk about or understand. I like to think of it as Israel casts a long shadow over the refugee and migrant trail that goes from Central America and south of Central America, but especially Central America up through Mexico. Like Israel's there everywhere with technology and counterinsurgency methods. I mean, it just there's just example after example after example and country after country and after country. And so when I had already known about U.S. settler colonialism and and knew how evil and terrible it was when did, when I see and was learning about Palestine. What was powerful to me is that this is an active, a more active and more visible example of this of versus what I had understood. Like I had, being here and all along the border, really, it's very difficult to see the traces of settler colonialism because it's sort of I think this living in a dominant settler society, it sort of just makes everything invisible. Uh, and so, for example, in history books, like the how the University of Arizona was founded and the territories along the border, what they looked like back then. I mean, it's something we can only see it in history books. But with Palestine, it's actively going on right now and has been going on, and it's an opportunity to prevent what occurred and continues to occur against Latinx and indigenous folks and communities and here. And as for connecting it to basic issues, things that working people and poor folks are dealing with, and I would include some of us, I'm sure, in that is food, having enough food to eat, having housing. I mean, I'm employed by a very dying and decaying industry, media industry, and yeah, I might write for Rolling Stone, but they pay shit. They don't pay, like and so like a lot of these issues are my issues when it comes to like say housing insecurity, when it comes to having enough food and relying on and contributing to mutual aid. These are opportunities, I think, for organizing. And yes, sometimes you're exactly right. I see the same thing, Bruno, where people are like, I need to, that what's right in front of me. I need to eat or I need to find housing. What does Palestine have to do with any of this? And and that's, there are opportunities for education and outreach there because, for example, I I lived recently across the street from an independent movie theater here, and they were showing this fantastic movie on Palestine and that won the Academy Award. I don't know if y'all got a chance to see that film, but they were showing it like literally at the same time that my next door neighbor was getting violently evicted and I was next. And I'm in the theater and I'm watching an infinitely more brutal and violent form of military, civilian, military settler driven evictions. Like I remember images from that film of an eviction notice, the same kind that me and my neighbor got, for example, and that they put on for example, at one point in the film, the civil administration, which is a civilian agency in the occupied territories, run by Israel, of course, and they're the ones that will go around and they put this eviction notice uh, on a park, a children's playground. Like this is an unlawful space and it's going to be like demolished. And then you see, and soon, like within seconds, the bulldozer come and destroy the whole thing. And then another image of later in the film destroying a school and children are inside screaming and the bulldozer is coming and or when the bulldozer will in another scene destroy a Palestinian home and just like the way that these structures a toilet and a bathroom are just being dug up and broke open and you see eviction in in a much more violent way than we see them here. And so to me, I mean, even now I've known about Palestine for a very long time and I've written about it but even earlier this year I'm seeing this film and it's reminding me, fuck, this is what's going on and we're paying for it all. And the United States is still Democrats and Republicans alike making all of this kind of brutal violence happening every single day. And this is, in the West Bank, this is in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and we're not even talking about Gaza, which is an even more unimaginable uh, place of immense suffering. And so, like all that to say, there are these connections to be made with what we see around us and what our colleagues and compas see, and how we can talk and discuss and connect that these things are all related and and showing how either we're from our taxes or just from allies of the nation state and society that dominates us is destroying homes 8,000 miles away that we can't see, or they're destroying homes here. There are these connections that are just yeah, undeniable.
To follow up on that, do you think making these connections through your research, like letting people know about like opiate systems and how that's literally in our backyards, and how they are like an Israeli company and like how all of that is like connected. Do you think having those kinds of conversations with people help as well to kind of like let them sympathize with the movement?
Yeah, right. And sympathize with the movement and as well as see that once you look into it more and more, you see that there is less of a divorce between these two realities, especially when we're here in the United States. And for example, we know how big and rich this and wealthy this nation is, and yet all the wealth is going to where certain places to benefit the few. And we know how the United States is very wealthy and and then you have Israel over here was the size of New Jersey, very tiny. I mean, what we can call Israel because it still is this country that has never declared its borders, and so like I think it's perfectly fine when some people will regard it in quotes or regard it as the entity, like lots of things, the Zionist entity. They'll say, like you can't blame them really, like when there's this country that is, again, they never declare their borders because they want to keep growing and changing and swallowing up Palestine. But historic Palestine is very, very small. Uh, the Israel is not rich like the United States. Like they are extremely tiny. But what was very, I think, illuminating is how, for example, in unit terms, Israel is twice the size of the United States when we're talking about per capita and of arms exports all over the world. Especially, when I talked about Central America, like that's just one part of the world, and that especially since the 70s, this is when their arms industry really started to increase, and today it's bigger than ever, and especially because of the genocide and the ongoing war on Gaza. But Israel's, again, like twice the size of the United States, just not only in terms of arms exports, but also Israel employs double the percentage of the national workforce in so-called defense industries. And another big one is that Israel has 500% greater per GDP from arms exports than the United States. And so when you see it in those terms, Israel's this war machine, and Elbit is one of their giants that is competing with the U.S. giants like Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which are all part of the biggest part, I would say, of the Israel lobby in the United States. A lot of people talk about APAC and everything, but APAC, I think, is really the weakest of a large and complex lobby force of which Christian Zionists are part. All those fundamentalist churches, Christian uh, lobby as a lobby force, and then there's the defense industries, Boeing and Lockheed, which exert an enormous influence on U.S. politics, and they all are working together about for making sure that U.S.-Israeli policy continues unabated, and along the border, all along the border, is and has been one of their greatest laboratories that they opened up with a lot of the same methods and companies that they've used in the laboratories of the West Bank and Gaza. And they'll even call it that. That a colleague and I wrote a story for Tom Dispatch that was reposted in places like Mother Jones and The Nation and elsewhere and we start off with this brigadier general who was talking at a drone and technology conference on the U.S. Mexico border in El Paso. And he used the word, like he was talking to other, border patrol agents, corporate vendors, and usually people don't, so-called polite society out in public, they'll be embarrassed or ashamed to use a word like laboratory to describe Gaza. But there, like he didn't bat an eye. He said it's been a great laboratory. Gaza has taught us a lot. It's been a great laboratory. And when I and my colleague were there, going to drone conference after drone conference there, as in Tel Aviv and all over Palestine and in Israel, we would talk to all these drone experts, and they would just openly use this kind of language. Like they see it as and this was nearly 10 years ago now. Like, and now it's a greater than ever for them. Like they want to export Palestinian suffering more than they ever have before. And part of that is through Albit and other kinds of companies and opportunities along conflict zones, as they call it, low intensity battle zones of the US Mexico border. There's still like more opportunity for them than ever before.
Absolutely. Excuse me. I guess building up on that as well. I think sometimes another aspect of why people kind of are afraid um, to try to help in the struggle is the the asymmetric apparatus of like what the surveillance technology industry is. Like you spoke about like how APAC is just like one of like the few like one of the like the least effective like ways um that they lobby. And so I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed when you're trying to fight against a big, crazy, scary thing like the military industrial complex. So what are like, how do you overcome that or have overcome that in the past? You know, even back then, like in 2011, when, like you mentioned, the leftists kind of left the Palestine struggle on the side. What was something that helped you kind of just like continue the fight up until this day?
Yeah, those are, yeah, that's the question, isn't it, for all of us as organizers and people who are trying to spread awareness about, I think, especially when I find, and we all do, like the odds stacked up against us and against ordinary people. I like to think of things like, the anti-slavery movement and what they were facing, and generations of struggle, white and black abolitionists together, taking decades and decades and decades to finally quell that institution. And of course, there were more problems cropped up, and but cases like that, child labor, for example, is another big victory for labor organizers in particular and working families who again through deaths of and mangling and mutilation of their children and decades of that were able to make real serious institutional change. I I take solace in how we, like as organizers in this moment, are connected, I think, to organizers throughout history, and to see ourselves in that kind of lineage rather than being alienated, which is very easy, especially in a society like this, alienated, like and alone, seeing like the just the scope of the destructive power that we're up against. And often we're not. Most often, we're not. We don't have anywhere near of a kind of the same kind of destructive power to fight back in those same ways, and so it then ends up being like often an asymmetrical kind of conflict of like armed versus unarmed or things like that. And so yeah, I like to look at history, and there's a lot of rich history, as we know, throughout the border over the decades about what organizers were able to accomplish under similar power dynamics in their day.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
You can go ahead, Chris.
All right, can you guys hear me? Audio good? Okay. Well, I have a question, and it's in regards to politics, especially now in the rise of authoritarianism. I believe that the community is very passive on all issues pertaining to anything outside of their home. And I just wanted to know, how do you think we should motivate and encourage the community to look beyond the scope of their homes and combat, things like American individualism? Because, people do care about these issues, but they're not willing to do anything about them. It's more until like it really affects them personally on like a really deep level. And even in some of those cases, they may still be passive. How do you think we should encourage these people to act?
Yeah, speaking of the home, like sometimes, especially in like very, very small communities, I've seen that, and even small communities within a bigger city, like there are always these kinds of dynamics. Sometimes it's a matter of bringing events into the home, like especially with regard to radical issues that aren't getting enough, say, popular sentiment to be in like a public, fill a lecture hall, for example. There are some issues out there that start in people's living rooms and then build from there. And I think those are particularly powerful, especially in the early days of like an incipient movement that isn't a coherent movement yet, but they often start in places like that, which I find to be inspiring. And on the question of passivity, even in examples of revolutionary movements that have actually taken power, one of the most inspiring for me since my teenage years has been Spain, with all the problems. This is a society that anarchists were in power, and like everybody will like, and the revolution was cultural. So oral histories of the time and memoirs of the time reflect everybody in worker clothes. Like that's how even like members of the wealthy elite like that couldn't get out of Barcelona in 1937 or so hid under factory clothes just so that they wouldn't be killed, and I like even in places like that there's often like a sizable portion of the population that is still passive, or like they'll be like, I think like for example, a peak of anti-war uh, sentiment in the United States during Vietnam. And other places throughout history, like the third will be against, a third will be for, and a third will be quote unquote neutral or passive or not. And usually when a situation reaches something like that kind of dynamic of conflict, that's when real change can happen. And so like even yeah, I feel like that passivity is going to be there, and it's a matter of just yeah, I feel like driving through it and continuing organizing and mutual aid work, whatever we're doing in our communities, and just to yeah, not like it. We don't have to like it that there's just so much apathy and passivity, but sometimes we have to keep going even when we're the, the radical minority in in situations, like the abolitionists in in the United States. There's some estimates of them, and some numbers are unreliable, but estimates of just a few percentage points are how numerous the abolitionists were. And so you could say like 90%, around 85, 90% are just happy to keep the status quo going and have like a huge passivity. And yet the anti-slavery movement was able to to commit some very incredible beats despite that apathy, despite that passivity. And I find that to be very inspiring.
To kind of add to that, I feel like, growing up and being raised in educational spaces, most of the things that you learn either about history, whether that be recent or, in the revolution, most people just see those things and those big movements that have maybe changed the course of history. I just feel like a lot of people just assume that the work is already done, and we're already at a place where we no longer need to do those things to move society forward. But I think that's where a lot of people are mistaken, is that the work is never done.
Yeah, very, very good point.
Does anyone else have any questions? Bruno.
Yeah, so I had another question. So when it comes to working, like organizing about Palestine, a lot of it is organizing with other people from other nations, right? Like, especially I imagine for the flotilla, like I know it was a lot of people from different nationalities, right? And so I wonder, like, how do you integrate people from other countries coming to speak, coming to share perspectives with people from your local community? Um, just that.
Yeah, yeah. I think, first of all, I love to find out as much as I can and learn and listen, because in a greater point here is what we can teach each other about our locales. And the greater point being, when I remember when arriving in Athens and getting ready to board our ship, you know what was happening? This was around the same time. The way I remember it is Amy Winehouse. It was that summer that Amy Winehouse died, and so it was around June, July, and that's neither here nor there. It's memory works very mysteriously sometimes, and I, remember where I was when a musical icon of mine died, and I was in Athens, Greece, and what was going on at that time, which was getting less press, was a precursor of what would become the Occupy movement in the United States a few months later. And I could not have known that. Nobody could have known. But I think it was something that we could have, if not expected, would have thought that was very possible, because what was happening is Syntagma Square, that is what it was called. It's just a few blocks from our hotel there. And then, yeah, as we were arriving, there were other internationals who were on their own ships, just like the flotillas of today and of last year, the year before that, from other nations. There was Italy, there was all over Europe, and some from even South America and Latin America. And then, where we were, the same hotel, like a few blocks over, where Parliament was, there was this emergency crisis because Greece was in debt to the World Bank and basically had a gun to its head, economic gun to its head. And people were starving. People were starving. People didn't have homes. They were out of jobs, and they were seeing that their government fail them and roll over to states like the United States, Germany, these powerful countries that could control them because of their debt. And so like people had had enough, and so like they took their tarps and their sleeping bags and created shacks and occupied, so to speak, the entire square. And this was happening, as we learned, this was happening all over Europe. But Europe didn't come up with it. Like several months before that was the Arab Spring, and square after square after square in the Middle East were being occupied and taken over to some extent. And then in some, but not all, of course, toppling the regime, committing like serious social change. And so the United States was very much at the end of that end of that line, end of that list. It was almost a couple of years after the Arab Spring until it went to Europe and then went to the United States. And I think like that's a greater point of how much we can learn from other ordinary people across the world that don't speak the same language of us as us, but they deal with similar forms of gangster capitalism, as it's sometimes called. And there are these ways that we're even unconsciously fighting back and resisting. But when you can make that even more conscious, it can be very powerful thing. And that's what came to mind when you asked that question. I hope that's a good answer.
Does anyone have any other questions? Or would like to learn more about like anything that Gabb has been speaking about so far, like the flotilla or anything like that?
One thing I would say, and yeah, please let me know if anyone has any questions, but one thing that occurred to me relatively recently in the last several months is how many boats I've been wanting to undertake an effort of like counting all the boats that Israel has seized, captured, and impounded or done whatever they've done with them. We're talking about dozens and dozens. It might be around 60 or 70 or more. And I wonder if like the golden age of piracy, it was like in the 1600s, 1600s. And I'm just curious if like any of the so-called pirates of the day were able to capture that many ships. Like I think a lot of people don't in the media, and for example, don't really see it in those terms because you don't realize how many, like around 2008 is when a couple boats of the Free Gaza movement, which was just starting up, actually made it to Gaza, and that was the first time international ships had docked at Gazan shores, and well, since before 1967 war, so it would have at that time more than 40 years, and since then, like 2008 was the only time that I am aware of where any of these boats, international boats, before the flotilla, like flotillas came in a little later of like stringing boats together, so to speak, not literally, but none of them have made it since 2009 to the present day. Like Israel's captured all of them and sometimes has killed passengers. And so that just like occurred to me to want to make that point that there's some historical insights, and that's only on internationals. Like there's a going back to the 70s. There's a quite a violent history of Israel kidnapping, killing boats and international just civilian charters, like whether from Lebanon or other surrounding countries to like international kinds of boats, and it's like this ongoing thing that I think doesn't get as much press or public understanding.
We have Adan asking a question in the chat. They said we've seen pro-Palestine protesters targeted by the Trump administration. Do you have any advice for the undocumented in our area who want to support the cause but are vulnerable to deportation? Also, any tips on managing anonymity? I can't speak. Okay, deportation. Also, any tips on managing anonymity? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Well, for that, I turned to some colleagues who were undocumented Palestinians, and I found that going back to a question or a couple questions, as this is maybe related to a number of questions about connecting issues. If you look at it in terms of US demographics, there aren't that many undocumented Palestinians, and there aren't that many undocumented folks from various Middle East countries. And that is because, and so I'm getting at, I wouldn't say some of this stuff publicly, but we're talking with organizers. So we're amongst ourselves, and or at least I'd be a bit more careful of how I frame things, publicly speaking. But one of the problems in reverse when we're in Palestine circles or vice versa in doing undocumented organizing and outreach with undocumented folks. There are problems from both sides. One of the problems that I would encounter on the side of Palestine circles is a class issue. Like there's a number of international students or international communities who have greater document privilege. You know, they have a lot of them come over on student visas, and once they enter upper class brackets, then of course on the one side, like especially after 9/11, there a lot of folks from the Middle East, especially who are from immigrant classes, even with citizenship, are targeted in various ways. But also there's a fair amount of class privilege, and with that comes sometimes anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's a very difficult. I remember, especially when doing that organizing, it's a very dicey, very difficult form of cross movement, cross community, not even yet collaboration, because once you have to get through some of these like anti-immigrant stigmas, like you'd hear the same shit that you would hear from white right wingers about immigrants from people who care about Palestine. And then that becomes like a very basic issue of education and outreach, where we have to navigate that kind of stuff. And what I saw help the most after a number of roadblocks of, you know, I won't even have to go into the kinds of like things that I and others would face with community members, either Palestinian or Iraqi or others. It would be like a language kind of issue. Like, I mean, what they're here illegally, you know, like they've broken the law, you know, stuff like that. Like things you would think are way beyond, at least, you know, some of us who are if not personally triggered by shit like that, you know, would be surprised to hear from a fellow progressive person. But what I saw would help break through that is showing, for example, what happened to Palestinians who, two of them, and there's some, I'd be happy to give you all some links. It really helped our organizing here. There were two Palestinians who went on this incredible, I don't know how they made it out of Gaza. So that's the first like big hurdle. They made it out of Gaza to South America, then traveled country after country up toward the United States, and and dealt with being unhoused, dealt with being poor, being out of money. Along the way, this journey took years, and they're learning, like many travelers, migrants or refugees, very resourceful, very like they're learning new language after new language to get by and get closer to the United States, where everything they'd heard about the American dream was they could you know, surrender to customs agents, and they thought be able to try and get political refuge, uh, and that they were they were arrested. They were not allowed to go into asylum proceedings. And this was about 2000. We're talking about 2015, 16, 17, and they were thrown into administrative detention. So kind of similar to what Israel has in their prisons for Palestinians, they political prisoners. Like, you don't have any official charge against you. You have not done anything wrong. It's administrative detention because Israel wouldn't take them. The United States doesn't recognize Palestine, and so there is nowhere to deport them to. So they're just indefinitely in prison. And my group found out about them because of an SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, member that I knew from New York City, because we were doing national organizing and connected, kind of like how DSA is. It's a very powerful thing. Those networks, you know, you often always have a couch to to crash on if you're in a strange city. It's a very, very beautiful thing. Not all the time, but and uh, randomly, she was now a law student, and she was in a clinic, a law clinic, and helping translate and meet with prisoners to try and help them with asylum cases. And that's when she met these two Palestinians, and because like they needed somebody who spoke Arabic, and that's how they met. And then before she was leaving the state, she put them in touch, and 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 almost immediately their story was so powerful because it was able to break down psychologically these anti-immigrant barriers that the community had in a number of places. Same thing with how, for example, in Palestine, this is around 2007 or so, it was reported in the Israeli press that the Mexican pruning, it's called in the industry from California, and this goes back to like the great boycotts and that the movement history of farm workers. The Mexican pruning is this method of date pruning, and it was imported you know, to the occupied territories, and so like using these manual methods. I hope this isn't very complex, but using these methods, it was called Mexican pruning. And so what they started to do, the companies that were employing Palestinian cheap laborers, they started calling them Mexicans for shorthand. And it's like example after example like that are ways that basic education levels really like would inform each other's movements and help us to like work together with with stuff like that. And I think so that's why I like my first thought to that question is a small but powerful story from undocumented Palestinians, and they're not as numerous in the country, but their stories can very well help um, inform around issues like surveillance and how to avoid deportation. And yeah, I hope that was a okay answer.
No, yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other questions?
Not necessarily a question, but referring to the question, any advice for people that want to support the cause? Um, the biggest thing we can do is have conversations, spread awareness, allow people to listen, but also listen to them and listen to the things that they, care about and, what drives them. But, in our households, in our communities, undocumented or not, I do believe that there's a lot of power in everyone's voices, and just making people aware of what's going on in the world and not just the community around them, making them understand that we are all part of a bigger picture here. I think that those are very important, and I think that's the most important thing that someone that may not feel comfortable going out in public and disrupting. That's pretty much the greatest power that they do have.
Thanks, Christopher. It's a great honor to be with y'all. Thanks for having me. And
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Very insightful. I appreciate you coming by to speak to us as well.
I do have one little, I suppose, question or advice seeking before we wrap it up. Um, in your research, you talked about how like the wall that Trump, quote unquote, ran on and wanted to build. It's always been there. And so through president, throughout the years, Border Patrol has like doubled um since its establishment in 1924. And so now, with most recently the Big Beautiful Bill and the immense budget that ICE will gain soon, I think it's definitely something that we'll be feeling here in the Valley. Um, we are the U.S. Mexico border, and so with that, um, uh, I wanted to ask you and how you navigate your research. Like, was there anything that you would recommend for us, or do you have any advice for us when it comes to trying to seek, who are the big actors in everything? Um, like, would you recommend like us making connections with UTRGV, which is our local like university, and seeing what's going on in their schools, and just trying like just being a nosy bitch, and like how would you recommend for us to navigate, someone that's not a researcher, someone who's just like a normal person who's just trying to like figure out um how to be nosy and kind of like let our community know about what's going on in our backyards.
Yeah, truly. Just keeping nosy and like finding ways to uncover whatever power structure you find is in your way, or one that you'd like to target, because being nosy is really where it comes from. Like I couldn't graduate high school. I don't have a bachelor's degree. I know, yeah, you mentioned how I write for Rolling Stone and a number of these other publications. No, I don't have any technical training. It really does go back to being fucking a nosy bitch. That's just who I am. And I've picked up skills along the way. A lot of them have been from mentors, editors, get into one publication or get into a fellowship and have a number of publications with them. And I'll learn investigative methods, and would be happy to do another session sometime, or just like send over resources about specifically how, say, to look for investments at a public university versus a private one, and or like how to get dirt on people. There are ways, like for example, a lot of journalists became private detectives because it pays more, a lot more, I can tell you. And do a background check on somebody, and it comes up everything. And I mean, it's the same kind of databases that law enforcement use. They're the ones that private detectives subscribe to. And it's like too much money for any of us to subscribe to them individually, but sometimes it's necessary to hire a private detective, and and pay them a billable hour or two to look up dirt on somebody, look up like personal information on somebody, if that person is a person of interest for whatever reason. And then it can be like public documents if you want to look up somebody's court record, or look at a company's portfolio, like get private documents even. The public documents are easier, private documents are a little harder, but it's not impossible if you're like wanting to target or research Starbase, SpaceX stuff, or be in touch with researchers on the border who are looking at human remains found in the desert, or every sort of zone has its ways of methods, of what methods work. To depends on like what you're trying to find out, but it's always possible, and you don't need to be a so-called expert at all. Really, you just need to be nosy and collaborate as much as possible with like-minded folks who have different skills. Skill shares are like, extremely important. I've like benefited from skill shares my whole life. I still benefit from them, and because it's just not something that you have to go to school for. And and yet, I still want to go to school, school. For example, like I'm in the office where this university gave me this prestigious fellowship, but I am not allowed to actually enroll in classes here because I don't have a bachelor's degree. And so like I want to get an MFA, for example, and do other kinds of writing other than journalism, but they won't let me in because I don't have a bachelor's degree. And so you don't technically need one, but that doesn't mean like I don't want one, like I think technical training does help, but it's not necessary. Uh, so yeah, like there's like the possibilities are endless. It just depends on like exactly what are you, yeah, be as specific as possible, like what kind of community and what kind of institutions, because every institution is a little different, has a little different of makeup, and they have their own weaknesses and they have their own leakage points. Like working with people who are on the inside has helped me too. Like some, defectors, I think rebels, defectors, exiled people, they can be very effective in like leaking you information, which is could get them in a lot of trouble. But because they can't do anything from within, surprise, surprise, reform doesn't work a lot of the time. Like then they can get information to a journalist or an organizer, activist, and and yeah, like there's many. I've even had cops like leak information and work with Black Lives Matter organizers to undermine their own department. And I think that kind of thing is rare, but it's pretty heroic when they do that because then the system comes down really hard on them, or they'll really target them because they know that yeah, moles from the inside, rebels, they can really do a lot of damage. And again, like that because they're making connections with organizers and activists from the outside. So yeah, like any kind of collaboration, learning from each other, like specific questions about the institution that you're wanting to learn about. Yeah, that's what it's all about. Being nosy.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, again.
Claro, claro. I'll just give it a couple seconds in case anyone has any questions. Um, but before you go, Gab, I wanted to ask like what's the best way to support your work? Is it like through your website or
Yeah, I'm wanting to do a better website at some point, but yeah, like publications, I usually if I have a new publication, I'll put it on the website. Thank you so much.
yeah, of course. I'll
Yeah,
I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat just in case if anyone wants
great.
to check
I
that
have
out.
I have a new one coming out soon. It might some of it deals with maybe that's something to leave on. Just it happens to be what I'm working on. I just filed it with my editor at the New Republic magazine, and it'll be coming out in the next several weeks. And it has to do with this pretty famous academic named Jason De Leon. Did these two books. This one won the National Book Award, and
Mhm.
he is accused of disappearing a database of missing migrants. So, like an organization called Colibri Center for Human Rights that was founded here in Tucson, and then works with a number of organizations, including in Texas. One of them is OpID, Operation Identification, where they try and the medical examiner's office here in Tucson, some institutions in Texas, they find human remains in the desert, often recovered from humanitarian workers, and then the Colibri's work was finding family members who were looking for their loved ones, last known to be crossing the border and were never heard from again. And so they'll take DNA samples from spit, a spit swab, and other kinds of DNA and demographic information, and then try and find a match to the human remains and give some closure to them. And the database was centralized, and there are lots of these collaborators from all parts of the border. And then suddenly it goes dark when this this like famous anthropologist takes over. And so meanwhile, these families are feeling lied to, they're feeling misled, and 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 manipulated. And so this story can shed light on this and hopefully pressure this organization headed by this famous guy to release the database, because they've shut it off. Like, so there are lots of possible matches and families out there that can be given some closure for their loved one that they're looking for up to 20 years ago that disappeared. And so like that's a story that I'll post on the website when it's published. I'm very humbled and happy and inspired to hear that you all would like to know about anything that I write about. So thank you so much.
No, thank you too for making the time
Of course.
and answering my email.
Oh no, of course. It was such a pleasure. Like I told you, I through that form, a contact form on the website, I never know who's going to be contacting me. Sometimes it's hate mail, Zionists. Sometimes it's editors looking for a story, and sometimes my happiest is when it's organizers who are wanting to connect, and so that does happen. Thank you.
I love it. I love it. We had someone on the chat say you're an honorary DSA RGV member. So
Oh, nice. What's that? What's RGV?
yeah, that's her chapter, the DSA RGV chapter.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
So you're a member, you're officially a member.
Oh, I hope to visit sometime if I'm through the area.
Yes, please. No, yes, I was trying to have my sister host you. I'm getting sidetracked, but I was trying to have my sister host you. She was super
Sure.
down, but DSA, we're barely growing, we're barely gaining those funds. So
Right. Well,
just give us a couple months and then we can bring you
sure.
down.
I'd be happy to, or vice versa. If any of you come to Tucson or anywhere near here, just hit me up.
Of course, of course. Is there anything else that you would like for us to share in the chat? Like your social media or anything like that? Um, or we're good.
Yeah, anything you have, feel free to send it out. Like for
Okay.
anybody, you can contact me, email, Insta, Twitter. Be happy to be in touch.
Sounds good.
And yeah, sure. Like my socials, I think this I'll put Insta
I got
and
it.
that. Okay.
I'll put in chat just in
And
case if
the
anyone wants to follow you.
and the Twitter or X or whatever it is
Ah, I see.
that. But yeah, please, I'd be happy to have more followers as it were. I'm not good on social, so uh, having people who are real people who are in touch and over social is great.
No, yes, of course. We gotta really amplify your work. The work that you're doing is really important.
Thank
And so, yeah,
you.
thank you guys, everyone, again for joining us today. I hope
Thanks.
everyone kind of like learned a little bit. Again, ultimately the we want to just like build awareness and solidarity and in time actions that help the liberation of Palestine. So I was really hoping that this conversation becomes like the starting point for us to organize at the local level in our chapter, whether it be like, participation in the global BDS movement or any other kind of just like efforts to resist border militarization. And so, yeah, thank you guys so much.
Thank you for your work. Bye.